So as someone who, putting this nicely, likes finding new places to put houseplants, I wanted to show you how you can mix the best of both worlds in both aquatic and terrestrial plants by putting terrestrial plants in an aquarium. So let me show you the different ways that I have found to be successful and a couple of tips that I have for navigating and making sure that everything gets to live the way it wants to. So first, why am I even talking about this? Why would you want to do this? It feels like there's a very hard set line on either the plant is aquatic or the plant is not aquatic, but there's a little bit of a gray area in there with plants that are able to propagate in water. They can typically end up staying full-time in an aquarium. Besides finding new ways to hoard plants, there are actually some benefits that terrestrial plants can have in aquariums. Namely, they are able to draw out impurities, much like aquatic plants, nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia specifically. Adding plants to an aquarium will also help stabilize the nitrogen cycle, which means there's a timeline extension between water changes for the times that you forget to do it or it ends up being a little late because you have ADHD like me. So let's talk about the types of plants that work best. Like I said, typically it's the ones that'll be able to propagate in water. So pothos, monsteras, philodendrons, lucky bamboo is really popular, ferns, peace lilies, and I'm also trying a couple of Tradescantia stems that I used in my plant light test video. Now that they have grown well and developed really strong roots in water, it makes sense. And also they're so pretty. Why not have some pink plants in there? That would be fun. Essentially, really idiot-proof hardy plants are able to be just plopped into water. Well, not quite plopped into water. We'll get into that in a second. I'm kind of curious if carnivorous plants could. I haven't tested that yet because I'm very precious about my Venus flytraps. So if you have and you have found it to be successful or not successful, yeah, leave a comment and let me know. I'd be really curious to hear about that. The ones that don't work that well are typically ones that can't handle water propagation. So I have Christmas cactus stems that hang out in my tanks, mostly because they've fallen off of the mother plant and it seems like kind of a waste to just toss them. So are they thriving? They have little hairs that are coming out, but I wouldn't say they're flourishing the way a pothos would. They're alive, and that's the best I could hope for, I think. But other succulents too, I don't think they would work. Again, if you have experience with that, leave a comment and let me know. This is kind of like a area. Plants that are considered to be toxic for cats and dogs by the ASPCA. On one hand, you probably want to avoid them if you can, but on the other hand, as long as your fish aren't munching on them, I guess it's okay. I don't know, to be honest. Sorry. I would say just if you're really concerned about the quality of your aquariums, I would say stick to the tried and true ones. But if you want to get a little crazy with it and you have a spare tank or something, give it a shot. Let me know how it goes. So how do you do this? Do you just kind of pull a plant out of a pot and, dust off the soil a little bit and plop it in? No. First, let's set up your tank for success. There's a couple of considerations you're going to need to have. One is light. So despite you putting this in an aquarium, it's not going all the way in. It's just going to keep its roots in the aquarium water. Consequently, the lighting system that you have for your aquarium might not be able to reach the plants that are above the rim of the aquarium. So first, you need to make sure that you're using an aquarium light that has a daylight spectrum that is designed for plants. You typically want one that has a timer on it, but you can, I've bought cheap GE timers that work just as well. The brands that I have used successfully are Hygger, and Nicrew. Really, I have no horse in this game. They have all worked fine. I typically like the Hygger or the Nicrew because they come with the built-in timer and they do have a spectrum. So they'll do a really cool sunrise and sunset. But Aquatic is fine too, especially if you're on a budget. I'll leave a couple of links below in the description so you can see the ones that I bought. So you're going to have to consider how the plant will attain light so that it can do photosynthesis. Easiest way to do this is to make sure that your aquarium is in a space that already gets some sort of light besides your aquarium light. So artificial light, sunlight, even blue screens, whatever. The more light sources it has available to it, the better. But if that's not an option for you, my recommendation would be to raise your aquarium light above the rim and not just have it sitting on top the way that they typically come standard. You want to find some way to support the growth of a terrestrial plant above the rim of the aquarium. Consequently, the aquatic plants that you have in your substrate might not get as much light. So that's something you have to kind of play around with and see what your best bet is. Another consideration, this is probably like a no-brainer for you, but I just want to say it just for completeness sake. You most likely won't be able to use your aquarium lids anymore. So if you have fish that are prone to jump or critters that like to crawl out, I have found the occasional cherry shrimp carcass on my aquarium stands. Just be aware of that. I know that most lids have a little bit of some space in the back, but I don't know, by the end of it, you just end up keeping the lid open all the time. One other consideration, and this is something I really haven't seen a lot of people talk about, the placement of your plant should be a place where it won't get bothered. I have had a poor history of this where I will put it in the front of the aquarium because like it's easy to access and it's pretty right there, and why not? But then whenever I'm doing water changes with my vacuum and moving from tank to tank, it ends up inevitably hitting the plant and either making it fall into the water or just damaging it. So just FYI, consider your placement for your plant before you put it in there and think about the way that you typically clean the tank, the way it functions, things like that. You know, you can put it in the back, obviously, but keep in mind if you have an air pump where the air bubbles go, because that can get weird with the roots and things like that. But that brings me to support. Now, you could just kind of like hang it off the rim and kind of hope for the best. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I feel like that puts a lot of strain on the stem. So what you want to do is find some sort of way to support it internally so that the roots can flourish and it's not really relying on itself to support itself. Some people really like to use the suction cups that are used for air tubing, but I find them to be too small and end up kind of, I don't know, just being too tight around the stem, and I feel like that stresses the plant out a little bit. Some people will instead use like plant root cages and kind of attach them to the side with suction cups. That's a good way to do it. You can put them in a hang-on back filter. Those work really well, except if you have roots that get to be really long, they might kind of get tangled, and that's a consideration you should have. Hey, quick update. There's also two other options that are available. One is this set that I'm showing of suction cup plant holders. I find that they're too shallow for plants that are meant to be terrestrial, and their suction cups are a little bit. I'm also testing these new hang-on rim holders. I can't recommend them just yet because I'm still testing them out, but I just wanted to let you know. The thing that I have found that works best is using suction cups that are designed for aquarium heaters. Let me get one, hold on. So this is what they look like. And you can see they're pretty wide, so they're not going to be ones that kind of like clamp onto the plant. In my experience, it gives them enough support that they don't have to rely on their own strength of stem to hang them up, but it's not so much that it's restrictive. Again, test different things and see which works best for your system. If you already have a hang-on back filter, start there. That is totally a fine way to do it. One other thing you want to take into consideration is the aquatic life that is already hanging out in your aquarium. Some fish and some critters may end up like doing a little bit of nibbling on the roots if they get really long, or if there's any leaf melt or stem melt that happens. So keep an eye on that. In my experience, it hasn't been a huge deal, but it has been something I've noticed. So FYI. One consideration that I don't think a lot of people think about, and the reason I say that is because I didn't realize it until it was too late, that if you have floating plants in addition to terrestrial plants, you have to be really mindful of making sure that those floating plants do not end up on the leaves of your terrestrial plant, because that will block their access to light, which prevents them from generating chlorophyll, which prevents photosynthesis and just makes your plant really bad. And especially crumbly floating plants that are like shellacked to leaves on terrestrial plants are super hard to get off. Again, I have learned that the hard way, so just be cognizant of that, because if your plant ever ends up accidentally falling into the water or something like that, you got to make sure that there's no residue or leftover floating plants like duckweed. And I give you that face because if you've watched my duckweed video, you know I hate it and can't get rid of it. Also, you want to make sure that your plant is free from diseases and is properly sterilized before you put it in the tank. So while you're taking a clipping from the mother plant, make sure you're using sterilized tools, because when you're cutting a plant, that cut becomes an open wound for both the mother plant and the clipping. So you want to make sure that no bacteria or bad stuff gets into either. It gets messy really quickly, so just always make sure you're sterilizing your tools before you're doing any kind of cutting or transplanting or propagating. And finally, the last consideration is plant food. How will you keep fertilizing your plants? Obviously, root tabs aren't gonna work that well, so you wanna make sure you have a good all-purpose liquid fertilizer that can handle both terrestrial and aquatic plants. So for my aquariums, I'll use a combination of root tabs for things like my Madagascar lace or my tiger lotus, and for the rest, I really like Thrive's all-purpose fertilizer, the shrimp specific one, because there are some fertilizers that get pretty harsh for things like shrimp, snails, coolie loaches, things like that. And this one I have found to be really gentle, and I haven't noticed any kind of critter death anytime I have put that in there. I usually fertilize my tanks about once a month and always have a root tab in my head, always, whether that's reality or not, going at all times. Let's talk about a couple problems you might run into. First is leaf rot. Leaf rot will happen if there's a leaf that is touching the water for an extended period of time. If you're noticing that's becoming a problem, raise the plant up by either raising the suction cup up or moving it to a different location. If you notice there are critters chomping on the roots, that's going to be a big problem, especially if the plant is considered to be a toxic plant. So I would remove the plant or try and trim the roots if it's non-toxic. And lastly, you might notice the roots can get really long and intricate on pothos, especially, I've noticed. So one thing you really want to make sure that you are avoiding is these roots getting really long and getting into things like air pumps, filters, anything like that, where there's sort of like a mechanism that can really tear up the plants. So keep an eye on them. If you notice that your roots are getting a little bit out of control, you can call them. It's not gonna be a huge deal the way it would be if you chopped them all off on like in soil. You can kind of meet in the middle there. So there you go. That's typically my best advice for how to keep terrestrial plants in aquariums. Overall, it's pretty idiot proof as long as you set the system up for success. So again, if you want to get started like right now today, make sure you have a good aquarium light that's meant for plants, make sure you have a way to support it, and make sure you're using plants that propagate easily in water. Otherwise, you're just going to make it so much harder on yourself to keep not only these plants alive, but your aquarium's cycle intact. Now, if you're kind of worried about that because you're like me and have ADHD and can kind of get inattentive, watch this video because I go into all of the details about how I maintain, like right now 4, but there's been many more aquariums while having inattentive ADHD. I'll see you over there.